All right, so today my guest is Nour Kteily. He's a professor at Kellogg Business School at Northwestern University. And well, first of all, thank you so much for coming and talking to me, Nour.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a little bit about your research on blatant dehumanization, but I like to start these off by just asking people more generally, what are the research questions that guide your work?
So broadly, I would say the research questions that guide my work most generally are thinking about social hierarchy. So all of my work starts from the observation that hierarchy is structured, or sorry, society is structured hierarchically with some groups on the top, some groups at the bottom. You can think about that across a whole host of domains which differ but do share some commonalities in terms of the structure. So things like gender hierarchies, racial hierarchies, national hierarchies, class hierarchies, and so on. And I think about all of the psychological mechanisms that help to uphold and in certain cases challenge those hierarchies, both thinking about how our group memberships shape the way that we engage with the world, and also some of our ideological belief systems, how things like our social dominance orientation um, and beliefs about how desirable hierarchy is in society actually shape how we orient towards other groups in the world around us.
Okay, that definitely touches on other things we've talked about in this class. But thinking about blatant dehumanization more specifically, could you talk us through your thinking about even starting off on this project? What made you look through the past literature and say, we need this project given what's out there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a funny story. I think it's shaped partly by my background, as I'll touch on in a second, but also partly by a very harrowing experience I had in graduate school, which is that I was part of a seminar, a social psychology seminar that was conducted by the late Dan Wagner. And as part of this class, it was all the graduate cohort. As part of this class, twice a semester, I guess it was, we were supposed to read a particular psychology paper, social psychology paper, and present it to the rest of the whole cohort. And I had done the first one had gone great. And so as I was preparing for my second one, which was a paper on dehumanization, I probably suffered a little bit from overconfidence bias, or, I read the paper and I felt like, I feel like I have a good handle on all of this. And then we had to also do a write-up, so I had written up the details of the paper, and I went to present it, and I completely blanked. I couldn't remember the distinction between, as it turned out, uniquely human traits and human nature traits, which are, come from the Nick Haslam model, which in the moment, as I was trying to remember which were which, I'm like, both of them have human in the title. And I got sort of confused, and it was an implicit study. It was a go, no-go task, which was not my forte. In any case, I froze for a full, 45 seconds, which in the moment feels like an eternity. And prior to that, I hadn't spent necessarily a ton of time thinking about dehumanization specifically, but after that experience, and Dan was great about it. I got the chance to chat with him and express all what was at that point my grad school angst, and he was great about making me feel better about it. But in any case, it stuck with me. And the one abiding thought I had about all that is, man, like that's all a very complicated way to measure dehumanization, and the complication has its merits. So Haslam's model, I think, is really generative and has highlighted some really interesting distinctions. But one thought that I had was, it seems to me that the reason that we're getting sophisticated or kind of approaching this in a complicated way from the measurement side is because of an assumption that people won't be willing to express dehumanization openly. And that didn't concord with my life experiences, growing up in the Middle East, looking at the rhetoric that groups oftentimes labeled one another with, and even not just in the Middle East, sort of more broadly outside of the weird, so to speak, societies, the, Western, I always forget all of them.
Western,
Industrialized
educated,
and rich.
industrialized,
What's the E?
educated.
Educated, okay.
Another speaker also used this acronym, and I forgot to comment on it, so it's worth saying right now, or I'll post it in the chat. But I think it's democratic as D, and we'll just have to stick.
R is probably rich, I would think.
Oh yes, exactly. So we got there.
All right, we got there in the end. In any case, so outside of those contexts, it seemed to me that people were much more willing to express these types of attitudes openly. And so I got to thinking about that. And I mean, much of my other research, in fact, like social dominance orientation itself is quite a blatant measure. So it's sort of in line with much of my general orientation to thinking about intergroup relations. So I got to thinking about how might we measure this attitude as overtly as possible. And actually the item itself that we ended up using to measure blatant dehumanization with came out of a survey that I'd been kicking around with Adam Waytz when he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. And we never ended up doing the study in question. It wasn't a study specifically about blatant dehumanization, but that's measure stuck in my mind, and we'd never done the study. And so after this experience and thinking about how to measure blatant dehumanization, I shot Adam an email and say, hey, did you ever end up doing anything with that measure? And he's like, no, not really. I'm like, well, do you mind if I use it for some preliminary work that I'd been doing alongside or been thinking about alongside my collaborator on much of this work, Emil Bruneau? And he said, no, go ahead. And so we just tested it. And this was around 2012. I can tell you when I presented this study in lab meeting the first time, everybody thought we were completely nuts, that we were going to get no variation on it whatsoever. I didn't know exactly how much blatant dehumanization we'd see, and I knew that we wouldn't get it for all groups, and we sort of didn't expect to get it for all groups. But when we came back and showed the results the lab meeting, I think people were pretty astounded just that there was any variation in it at all. And from there, we started to explore it in a whole host of different places and look at its correlates and covariates. And
right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up. It says something about, we talk a lot about measures in this class, and oftentimes the most elegant measures are the ones that you really try not to overthink. And so some of the really most impactful measures are very straightforward, and it looks like yours falls right in line with all of that. So I have a silly, maybe a silly prompt for you, but I think it's going to be a good question. So stick with me here. All right. So let's pretend that tomorrow we uncover an entirely new culture on Earth that no one else has found before. Nowadays, that might not be on page 1 of the news, but let's pretend that we at least hear about it. And this culture has many different groups of varying different status. And the anthropologist, before they set out to visit this culture, gets in contact with you and says, well, what are the preconditions that you would expect in order for us to find evidence of blatant dehumanization within this culture? So that's a long way of saying, what do you think are the basic building blocks or the primary ingredients that you need to see in order to find blatant dehumanization?
That's a great question. I'd probably need more time to think through it very carefully and precisely, but I can give you some of my off-the-cuff reactions. I think a big part of it has to do with status differentials and power differentials. So you mentioned, and we know for sure that it's not the case that low power groups never dehumanize high power groups. So it's not that blatant dehumanization only operates down the status hierarchy, but one psychological element that I would expect to really factor into the type of phenomena that bring about blatant dehumanization are status differences, because a large part of the bases we think of blatant dehumanization have to do with things like perceiving another group as uncivilized and beneath us, right? So or disgusting or incapable, that in many ways build upon many of the stereotypes that follow from social hierarchies and the tendency for groups at the top to exploit groups at the bottom. If we think about the groups that get dehumanized today, groups like African Americans, if we think about groups like Muslims and Arabs, you can think about a lot of different reasons. Not every group gets blatantly dehumanized for exactly the same reason, but one of the things that is common across them is some perception of that group being beneath the group that's at the top of society. So in African Americans' case, historically perceptions of them as savage or barbaric or not sort of mentally capable to the same extent as the dominant group. Similarly, to some extent with Muslims and Arabs as holding cultural standards that are inherently inferior than those of the dominant group. So I would think status differences would be one of the things that I'd want to see to feel confident that there may be blatant dehumanization.
Mm-hmm. Is there maybe what about a history of scapegoating or any more historical aspects that you might think might need to be there in order for this type of blatant dehumanization to evolve?
So conflict would be another one that I hadn't mentioned, right? Conflict and or exploitation. I'm not sure about scapegoating per se so much. I mean, scapegoating, I would imagine, would follow along with things like the desire to have exploited that group in some way or control that group. And in some regards, when I said status differences, I mean a little bit more specifically than just, some groups are looked up to in society. I'm rather thinking about structures, social structures where some groups dominate other groups, or differences in rank. So I would think about those types of situations where a group or set of groups has been able to, in some way or another, exploit and take advantage of other groups at the bottom.
Okay. Going back into present day, the real world, one question I have for you about blatant dehumanization is, to what extent, when people hold these views, is it part of their identity to express them? So making the parallel between motivation to control prejudice, and now more recently we know about motivation to express prejudice. So when people have these prejudices, it's important for them to express them as part of their identity. Is the same true for blatant dehumanization, you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have some data on this. So in a study that Patrick Forcher and I did on psychologically profiling the alt-right, we actually looked at the correlation between the motivation to express prejudice and blatant dehumanization. What we find is consistent with what we found in general with respect to the correlation between dehumanization and prejudice, which is that they're associated, but they're also meaningfully distinct. So you might have imagined, it's not an unreasonable hypothesis to say, well, you give people this extreme measure and they say that some groups are lower on this extreme scale. All this is a desire to express negativity towards this group. But actually the correlation between the motivation to express prejudice and the blatant dehumanization measure was only in the region. I mean, it's online somewhere, so you could find it, but it's something in the order of 0.3, 0.4. It was actually a little bit even lower than I expected, to be honest.
Yeah.
And we also found, and I believe that's in the main set of regression analyses, we actually looked at some outcome measures including both blatant dehumanization and the motivation to express prejudice, and they appear to have distinct effects. So in short, I do think that they're associated. I definitely think that there's some group of people for whom they wear that blatant dehumanization on their sleeve and they're not shy to express it. But it doesn't seem to be the case that the only people who express blatant dehumanization are those who are just trying to offend, so to speak.
Okay, so people can have these views but not necessarily feel the need to express them. They're associated, but yeah, distinct.
Yeah, interestingly, along the lines, just to follow up briefly on that point, we actually have some recent work that shows that even people who openly disavow blatant dehumanization nevertheless have mental representations of groups that may be blatantly dehumanizing. So there is a paper that's currently in press in JEP General that's led by a Northwestern graduate student, Chris Petsko, who worked on this with me, where we use the reverse correlation measure to look at liberals and conservatives' mental representation of Arabs, as well as people who are high and low on blatant dehumanization of Arabs on the ascent scale. And we find very little differences, such that even political liberals and people who at the overt level express very little blatant dehumanization still have mental models of Arabs that are rated by others as very blatantly dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that leads in quite well to my next question. So in my class, we talk a lot about implicit measures. Mm-hmm. I know in your paper, you kind of make this distinction between the content of a dehumanization measure, whether it is more blatant versus more subtle, and then the means by which you complete the measurement, whether it's more explicit or implicit. I find that a little bit surprising because, to some people, they might think implicit, blatant something is a bit of an oxymoron. So in your own research or in this field more generally, what do you think are the value of these implicit measures that are assessing these more blatant associations?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a super new area for me, but we're not the first to think along these lines, although the previous work that's been done in the space hasn't necessarily looked at the ascent measure that we've put forward. You can think, for example, about some of the work of people like Phil Goff and Jennifer Eberhardt, who've considered an implicit association between African Americans and apes, let's say, right? And the distinction, I would say, is that the reason why I don't think it's necessarily oxymoronic, I mean, it depends on how you define blatant, but I think that when you don't define blatant as just explicitly and consciously held, but rather look at the nature of that belief, you can start to see distinctions. So for example, a lot of the work on infrahumanization is about a group's capacity to experience certain emotion, right? So you could say at the implicit level, I associate, let's say Canadians for a second, with less capacity to feel pain. But, while the capacity to feel pain, or let's say maybe even more straightforwardly, I slightly implicitly associate Canadians with less capacity to experience shame or joy than I do Americans. That's certainly not inconsequential, but if I instead say I implicitly associate Canadians with savages to a greater extent, that starts to feel a little bit different, right? The same reason why we might differentiate at the explicit level between perceptions of savagery and perceptions of the capacity to experience joy. If I have that implicit association, you might expect those to be somewhat different as well. Now, the completely open question is what happens when you make people aware of their implicitly blatant dehumanizing views, right? So in the work that I was describing, we don't really know about the extent to which a political liberal might, be knowledgeable about the fact that they harbor this mental representation, right? So I might say at the explicit level that Arabs are completely human, and then you look at a more sort of implicit measure of my mental representation, and it turns out that I represent Arabs as looking just as savage as someone who explicitly says we think they're animals. How a liberal would react to learning that is really interesting, right? It could be the fact that if you make them aware of that belief, they'd be completely horrified and disavow it and take steps to change their behavior. It could be that actually our explicit measures are something of an underrepresentation because maybe people who are politically liberal know that they shouldn't be expressing an attitude that perhaps they do harbor a little bit more subconsciously. Which is interesting and also an open question. And then it's also possible that sometimes these mental representations may be affecting behavior in ways that are outside of our conscious control, right? A lot of these attitudes, like it could be that liberals truly don't blatantly dehumanize at the explicit level Arabs, but they're constantly encountering media, films, movies, news reports that are consistently representing Arabs in blatantly dehumanizing ways that might shape and form your stereotype or your mental representation of that group. And in certain contexts where that representation gets activated outside of your awareness, it might actually shape your beliefs separately from your explicit blatant dehumanization. So I agree, it's an odd concept, and we struggled a little bit with thinking how to name it, but I actually, with time, I've come to believe that implicit blatant may not be quite as oxymoronic as it seems on the surface.
Fair. I mean, that's an interesting point that you raised. I mean, you just told us the background about the development of the ascent scale, where you were looking at self-report explicit measures, and you thought that they were being a little bit too soft-gloved about it. And when you look at what we use for implicit measures, the valence that we use is generally positive, negative. And so who's to say that maybe we can get more out of something that also is looking at these more blatant forms of implicit measurement. So maybe a similar revolution could happen among the implicit measurement. Someone watching will have to do it. So I guess I only have you for a few more minutes. Try and get two more questions in. So are there you talked a little bit about current uses of this dehumanization that you're excited about, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about other current projects looking about changes in dehumanization in response to COVID-19.
Haven't focused quite so much on COVID-19, partly because I think there will be a lot of people, maybe not necessarily with our scale, but I think this is an area of active research for a lot of people, and haven't wanted to wade directly into the COVID-19 situation with our dehumanization work. That said, I will say, I mean, there's a lot of, well, both anecdotal and at this point, not so anecdotal, like empirical evidence suggesting that certain groups who are associated in some way with COVID-19 are being targeted more with hate acts, so in particular people of Chinese origin. And I've seen a couple of papers online that have looked using computational social science methods at anti-Asian hate speech online and tracked sort of how that followed things like statements that were made by government officials in the United States. So for all the reasons that we would generally expect outgroup threat to be related to dehumanization, I have no doubt that, at least in certain contexts, certain framings of how coronavirus have played out could make certain groups subject to dehumanization.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see a slew of research on that in the years to come. Okay, last question. I like to end all these in a similar way. What are the topics or issues that you hope the field of intergroup relations makes the most progress on in the next 10 years?
That's a great question. You know, there's so much that we need to explore. I can tell you a little bit about some of what has been capturing my attention most recently, and actually part of the reason why I haven't done as much on coronavirus right now is because I'm excited about the projects we're already currently working on in the space. I look at, as I think about the work that is relevant to thinking about our social hierarchical structure, I think about how relatively little has been done on solidarity between relatively disadvantaged groups. So it's been great to see the work of certain people like Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson that have really started to think through what are the conditions under which groups who are commonly subjected to disadvantage might band together. I think that is an area that has a lot of promise and a lot to continue to be explored. Somewhat related to that, I've been thinking a lot about more radical shifts to the current social hierarchy and thinking about our beliefs about what society might look like if different groups were in different locations in the social hierarchy. So I'll give you an example. In one line of work, we've been looking at what do white people believe that Black people would do with power if they had it, which sounds kind of fantastical unless you think a little bit recently. In recent weeks, it's become all the more relevant as there's been a big conversation that you may have followed by the related to the hashtag Black is Better, or conversation by the Black former athlete and comedian and actor Terry Crews, who said, you know, we need to make sure that Black Lives Matter doesn't turn into Black Lives Better. And that sparked a big conversation about, you know, if Black people had more power, would they use it to create equality or would they use it to recreate a system of domination? And it struck us that, you know, white people probably have meta perceptions about those types of beliefs or those types of possibilities. And it may be that these beliefs are part of whether they're projected or actual beliefs, they may be part of what contributes to the resistance of groups at the top to give up power. And, you know, one thing that I thought was informative in this regard is to think about the transition to power in apartheid in South Africa. I'm imagining, you know, part of, and there were a whole slew of reasons why there was ultimately a transition of power. I certainly don't think this is the only thing, but part of what I imagined towards the end contributed to white South Africans being willing to share power or give up some power is partly the approach that Nelson Mandela took towards the end to reiterate and make clear that, you know, he intended for it to be a power sharing agreement rather than a system of dominance. So we've been thinking a lot about what are people's beliefs about what other groups would do with power. And then the stuff I'm most excited about is some work looking at creating in the lab some social hierarchies and then reversing them to see what actually happens when you have, in a simulation, when you have a group that was formerly disadvantaged in some way and now actually has control over the other groups in society. So trying to think through, so generally to answer your question, over the next 10 years, I think we can do more to think about more radical rearrangements of society and what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this hierarchy and social status, relative differences between the group or rank order statuses across groups is going to change, and how the consequences of that is going to depend very much on the meta perceptions of people whose power is changing. So in 10 years, you can come back and tell us that we solved that research question. But I really just want to thank you for your time, Nour, and I appreciate you chatting with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.